Welcome back to ABA Beyond the Data. I'm your host, Jay Burton, BCBA, and more importantly, the proud parent of two amazing boys who just happen to be on the autism spectrum. This podcast is dedicated to providing practical solutions for the practicing clinicians out there, BCBAs, BCAABAs, RBTs, and grad students who live in the real world, not in the contrived lab settings that we oftentimes see in research, where every single function is ran in an FA and every single step in an intervention is perfectly implemented. The real world with insurance deadlines, staff calling out, and parents who are doing their absolute best and mean their best, but can come across a little strong sometimes. Around here, ABA isn't just a bunch of acronyms and graph lines. It's about real people, real families, and the real lives that we impact every single day. It's that moment when a kid uses a new flexible phrase instead of melting down. It's the parent who texts you that they had a calmer bedtime for the first time in months. That's the stuff that matters, and that's what we're here for. And as a parent of two boys on the spectrum, I'll tell you straight up, language is the whole game. When your kid can communicate flexibly, ask for things in different ways, handle no without the world ending, talk about their feelings, your entire day feels different as a parent. When language is rigid or it's brittle, like it breaks apart so easily, when one tiny change to a rule or a routine sends everything off the rails, it doesn't just slow progress, it creates stress. It changes how the whole family moves through the day. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Language and how us BCBAs believe it forms. Specifically, we will be speaking about relational frame theory. And if you just heard those words, relational frame theory, and felt your brain do an immediate assent withdrawal, I get it. This is not everyone's favorite topic. And for a podcast that's all about practical solutions for the practicing BCBA, you're probably thinking, why? Why are you doing this to us? Why are you pulling us back to our grad school torture sessions? But here's the problem. Whether you like RFT or not, it's describing stuff we deal with every single day working in ABA. Language that doesn't generalize, rigidity in routines and in language structure, following rules so precisely that it almost seems like they're doing it in a way of defiance. And today, my goal is to take some of that fear that comes with this out of it. We're going to talk about relational frame theory, not as an academic exercise, not so you can pass a graduate course, but as a way to understand why some learners get stuck, why generalization falls apart, and how we can build more flexible, humane programs that actually work in the wild ABA that's out there, and not just at the table time DTT sessions. All right, so here's our roadmap for today. This episode is going to be intentionally broad. I'm not going to turn you into an RFT research expert in an hour. That's not the point today. The point is to give you just enough of a foundation that when you're looking at that kid who's rigid with rules or that teen who can ace every social script in session but still crashes out at lunches, you have a better mental model for what's happening and more options for what to do. So first, we're going to talk about what RFT actually is. Just a simple behavior analytic way of explaining human language and cognition. What does it mean to say humans relate things, and why does that matter to ABA? Second, we'll boil RFT down to only 3 ideas that you actually need to know. There are a ton of technical terms in this area, but I want you to walk away with just 3 core concepts that make sense, that you can explain to supervisees or a parent without completely losing them. Third, we'll look at where RFT shows up in everyday ABA. The kid who can label 50 emotions on flashcards but can't tell you I'm mad in the moment. The kid who treats 2 minutes like a legal contract, the teen who has 20 conversation scripts memorized but falls apart when a peer approaches. All of that has relational pieces. Fourth, we'll move into how to apply this as a BCBA. Not a full formal RFT curriculum with fancy materials, just a broad moves and strokes that we can take. How you think about the assessments, how you write goals, how you design programs for flexibility instead of brittle perfection, and how you can coach staff and talk to parents about rigidity. From there, we'll move into guardrails, some scope, ethics, and staying in our lanes as behavior analysts because RFT oftentimes gets mentioned in the same breath as acceptance and commitment therapy, and having a foundational understanding of RFT does not make you an expert of ACT. So, we'll talk about when to refer out or to get more training in ACT specifically. And finally, and unfortunately, we will end on a terminology breakdown because here's the reality of RFT. It is very academic, and when individuals speak on RFT, they oftentimes speak with this assumption that all individuals understand exactly the terminology that they're using and saying. And so, understanding this terminology will give you the ability to build upon this foundation that this episode is trying to give you by going out and reading up more on it or listening to other podcasts that dive deeper into it. This is a foundational CEU. It is not a graduate level course on the subject. And of course, this episode is eligible for CEUs. So, a quick CEU reminder: this show is ACE certified to provide continuing education units for BCABAs, BCBAs, and BCBADs. And starting, now, 2026, for RBTs, you can get your professional development units. Here's how it works. At 3 different points in this episode, I'm going to drop a keyword. When you hear it, jot it down, voice memo it to yourself, or whatever you need to do to remember it. Because if you want that CU credit, you'll need to head over to aba-ceus.com after you listen. Click on the Get CEUs tab and find this episode on Relational Frame Theory, episode 10, and enter those 3 keywords. Once that's done, you will receive your certificate within about 24 to 48 hours. And as always, if you're interested in any of the research behind what I'm talking about today, check out the description of this episode on whatever platform you're listening on. I'll have the key references and links there. All right, let's start with what RFT actually is without making you regret pressing play on this episode. So let's strip this down and say it in the simplest way possible. Relational frame theory is a behavior analytic way of explaining human language and thinking. Instead of saying cognition is this mysterious internal thing, RFT tries to talk about language and thought as patterns of behavior, specifically, patterns of relating things to one another. Here's the big idea: humans don't just learn that this word goes with this object, we learn whole networks of relationships. And once those relationships are in place, they start to control our behavior, even in situations where we've never been directly taught what to do. So think about a typical VB map heavy program. We teach ball means ball. The child hears ball, they say ball. They match the ball picture to a ball object. That's all good. But RFT is asking a different question. Did we also teach the learner how ball relates to other things? It's asking, did we teach that ball is bigger than or smaller than or same as this other object? Did we teach that it's different from A to B or better than or worse than this thing over here or kind of the opposite of this over there? All of these things are relational patterns, and those are the ones that drive flexible language. Here's a concrete example. If I tell you A is bigger than B and B is bigger than C, Nobody has to sit down and explicitly train you. Okay, if A is bigger than B and B is bigger than C, that means A is bigger than C. You just can assume that. You just know it. You derive that relationship. That's a simple example of derived relational responding. Or take this one, this real life example. You learn as a kid that fire is hot and hot things can burn you. Later, you're told that the stove is hot. So even if you've never been burned by a stove, you still show weariness and caution around a stove as a child. The meaning of stove has changed through language. It's part of a network with hot and danger and don't touch. You're not just responding to the physical properties in front of you. You're not just responding to the direct stimulus in front of you. You're responding to the relational network that has history built behind it. Relational frame theory is basically saying this is what human language does all day. It builds these networks. A is bigger than B, and so A is bigger than C. This is kind of like that one thing I once saw at the store. This is definitely worse than that thing over there. This is like that thing that hurt you that one time before. And those networks make it possible for us to problem solve, to plan, to use metaphors, to follow rules, and to understand social situations without having to be directly taught every single situation. And that's really powerful stuff. But here's the catch, it can go both ways. Those relational networks that develop can make behaviors more flexible and efficient, but they can also make it rigid and stuck. In ABA, a lot of our programming is really good at building the building blocks, matching, labeling, following basic instructions, but sometimes we stop there. We teach the topography, we say the word, we point to the picture, we choose the right card, but we never really build the relational network that lets the learner use language flexibly out in the real world. So you end up with kids who can label happy and sad and angry when presented with pictures on a flashcard, but can't tell you that they're frustrated when their iPad is dying. Or with kids that can answer very basic questions about themselves, like their name, their age, what school they goes to, what state they live in, but can't navigate real back and forth conversations with peers. And RFT gives us a way to describe that gap without saying, well, they're just not generalizing or they're not motivated. It says maybe we built a bunch of isolated responses instead of a relational system. Now, RFT has a ton of terminology: mutual entailment, transformation of stimulus functions, a whole zoo of relational frame definitions. We are not doing a full glossary today, though I will cover 5 top terms you need to know at the end of this podcast episode, just so that you can keep up with your professor as they're talking a mile a minute about this. But what I do want to do is give you 3 big ideas from RFT that will make the rest of this episode click and make understanding relational frame theory a whole lot easier. If you can hold on to these 3, you'll be able to look at your current programs and think, this is why our kids' language is so brittle. Or you can say, here's where I need to build more relations and not just more targets. So let's talk about these 3 ideas. The first idea is that derived relationships happen and they're not mystical or coming from nowhere. As humans, we are really good at deriving new relations without being directly taught every single one. In RFT language, this is derived relational responding. In plain language, it's when a learner puts 2 and 2 together based on the relationships they've already learned. If your learner knows dog and animal, and later you ask, is a dog an animal? They might say yes, even if nobody has explicitly taught them that a dog is an animal. They're using what they know about animals and what they know about dogs and deriving the fact that a dog is a kind of animal. That is derived relational responding. If a teenager learns that being late is bad and getting detention is what happens when you do something bad, they may start feeling anxious even when they're only running a minute or two late. Their body and behavior are reacting to a whole relational network. Late equals bad, bad equals trouble, trouble equals punishment. Nobody taught that chain step by step. It's grown over time. And for many of our autistic learners and kids with developmental disabilities, this derived responding shows up unevenly. Some kids derive relationships super fast in certain areas and almost not at all in others. Some kids learn dozens of specific responses but struggle to pull anything into new situations unless explicitly taught it. That's where we get this inflexible, very brittle language. They can respond beautifully when the SD looks exactly like what they've practiced. But the moment we change the wording or the context, it falls apart. It's not that they're lazy or non compliant, the relational systems underneath just isn't built out yet. All right, and now moving into the second big idea that I want you guys to grasp is that humans don't just learn one way relationships, we flip them around oftentimes. In more technical terms, if you learn that A relates to B in a certain way, you can often automatically derive that B relates to A in a corresponding way. That's bidirectionality. In plain language, if I teach a child that this card says big and I show them a big block, they may later be able to see the big block and say big. Or they may see the word big and choose a larger item, even if I never train those exact directions. Or if I tell you, this person over here is your boss, you don't just learn from that statement that, oh, I report to them. You also derive things like, they have authority over me. Their approval matters. I probably shouldn't talk to them the same way that I talk to my best friends. Those are bidirectional relationships. We're not just thinking, we report to them, we're thinking back on what does reporting to them actually mean. That means they have authority over me, that their approval matters. This is bidirectional. And this really matters in ABA because a lot of our teaching is heavily one directional. We do a ton of listener training, like I say touch dog and you touch a picture of a dog, or label training, you see a dog and you say dog. That's fine and absolutely appropriate at certain stages. But if we never build bidirectional relationships, the learner may get stuck in very narrow stimulus response chains. You see this with kids who can answer 1,000 WH questions, but cannot ask them independently or has not shown that they will ask them independently. Or kids who can identify that someone else is sad, but can't connect it to when I do X, Y, and Z, mom looks sad. And that actually matters. Okay, and the third idea that will really help you in understanding relational frame theory through the eyes of pediatric ABA, and the one that I think is most clinically powerful, is that language changes what things mean to us, and that changes how we behave. We're not just responding to the physical properties of the world, we're responding to the meaning those things have picked up into our relational networks. Think of the word no. For one kid, no might mean not right now, but something else might be possible. Mild disappointment and a little flexibility may be a counteroffer for this one kid, but for another kid, no might mean a looming meltdown. The end of the world, I'm never going to have a chance to do this. It equals loss. It means you don't care. It means zero control over my environment. The sound no is the same. That stimulus does not change, but the functionality is totally different because of the history of the two learners. Or think about grades in school. For some kids, a B is fine. For other kids, a B feels like failure because of all the relational stuff wrapped around it. B equals not good enough. Not good enough equals dad is disappointed in me. Dad disappointed equals I'm a bad kid. From an RFT perspective, we'd say the function of stimulus has transformed through the relational networks. Again, in plain language, words, rules, and symbols can become conditioned triggers, motivators, reinforcers, or punishers in themselves, not because of direct contact with the consequences in the present, but because of how they're related to the past experiences which we've had. As BCBAs, this should all sound very familiar. We already care about rule governed behavior. We already watch how rules and instructions can override direct contingencies. RFT is giving us a more detailed vocabulary for that. That's all. But you don't need all the jargon to use the concept. What I want you to hold on to is this. When you see a kid reacting big to something that looks small, there's probably a relational network underneath it. And if you ignore that network and only treat what's on the surface as attention seeking or escape, you can miss the mark. We're not mind reading private events here. We're not becoming pseudo therapists diagnosing anxiety. We're simply acknowledging that verbal behavior, the rules, labels, and thoughts function like any other behavior. It's shaped by history, it participates in contingencies, and it can transform how other stimuli function and affect our own behavior. Hearing the word no is easy for some. Hearing the word no to others can be extremely difficult. All right, now that we've got those three ideas on the table, let's talk about where this stuff actually shows up on your caseload. Because I promise you, you already are dealing with RFT issues, whether you call them that or not. And before we go any further, we're going to pause right here for just a second. Your first keyword of the day is relations. That's RELATION. Relations. All right, let's talk about where RFT comes into play all the time in pediatric ABA. One of the most common patterns I see, and I'm sure a lot of you do as well, is a learner who is fantastic at learning a response but struggles to learn a concept. You sit at a table with them and they are a machine. They can label like 50 emotions. There's not even 50 emotions that I know of, but man, they can label like 50 of them. They can tell you happy, sad, frustrated, excited, bored, worried. They've got the little cartoon faces down perfectly. But when they're actually having their own meltdown, when they are dysregulated, when they're not feeling great, when their face is red, their shoulders are up high, when they're breathing fast, and you calmly ask, "Hey, bud, how are you feeling right now?" And they look at you and they say, "Happy," because that's the one that's been reinforced the most. And same for those that are memorizing WH questions. They ace every program you throw at them, and then in real conversations with real peers, nothing shows up. This is where we have to stop blaming motivation and lack of generalization and start asking ourselves a different question. Did we teach flexible relational networks, or did we teach a memorized script that becomes very brittle away from the table or away from therapy? Because from an RFT perspective, that emotion program might look like we've just taught a bunch of one-way relations. This face goes with this word. This picture goes with this label. But we didn't connect those to the learner's own internal experiences or to situations or to actions they can take and understand when they feel a certain way. All we did was build a little island of knowledge, not a continent, not a map of understanding and relationships of what the word actually means. So when we design programming in from an RFT lens, we're saying, okay, after we teach the basic foundation of this word means. Let's start teaching the relations of it. For example, for emotions, we start relating it to other words, like sad is a kind of disappointment. You feel frustrated when something doesn't go your way. When I'm working with a kid who's going through a behavior, first of all, I am always engaging with them because that kid should never just feel isolated. But I am oftentimes scripting what they're feeling. This is working wonders for many of my clients because they are starting to understand when I reacting this way, Mr. J is oftentimes saying this word or that word, and they are building relational networks. And the other day, I had a situation where a kid just straight up screams, I'm mad. And I was so happy because I had been saying, like, oh, I see that you're frustrated. I see that you're mad right now. And they had not been expressing this emotion at all. But boy, it turned around. And I never directly taught that. So when we start relating words to other words, when we relate words to bodily sensations and feelings and to contexts and even to coping strategies, we set up situations that allow for the child to connect relations, to connect words to the meanings, to the feelings, to the deeper understanding of what they are. One thing I love using is movies, especially when working on emotions, because oftentimes we simply don't get to see every single emotion in our everyday lives in the clinics. The movie Inside Out, it's an amazing movie for, any kid. But it's also an amazing movie for our practices because you can identify emotions in very dramatic ways and the situations and contexts that lead to it, making those connections and those relations. And of course, it's very good at showing the expressions, but it also has several scenes in it that honestly really hit home. I mean, that movie can be a tearjerker in certain places. So it allows us to work on that sensation for those individuals that understand it and help them identify what that real feeling is of sadness or anger or frustration or anxiety. Of course, there are a variety of movies out there that you can use for this, but that's a good one that I love to go to. Using movie scenes or identifying when a peer is frustrated or sad. This is critical because it allows us to actually see those real moments that's happening in real life. We're building a network where frustrated isn't just a cartoon card. It's a thing that happens to us that we feel inside, that we're responding to. And of course, I'm working on things like, identifying things that make us mad and identifying things that we can do when we're mad and we're frustrated and things that we do when we feel like we've lost control and what that looks like when we've lost control. We're working on all of these different things, and that's what relational programming should look like. Okay, and let's talk about another huge bucket: rigidity. So many of our treatment plans and our behavior intervention plans have some form of rigid behavior built in them, whether or not we're talking about reducing it as a challenging behavior or working on replacement behaviors for it. This includes things like difficult with changes, insisting on sameness, or difficulty with transitions. But here's the thing: if you look at it through an RFT lens, what you often see is not simply escape from the task. You see rule governed behaviors that's gotten way too strong. You do a silly voice to encourage the kid to go to the table one time, and now every single time you go to that table, the kid is expecting you to do that silly voice. Or you use a first then statement one time with a client, and now they will never work unless you specifically say first blank, then blank. Or you work on the client asking for more time, and your RBT makes the mistake of pulling out a timer, and they visually see those 2 minutes and exactly how much time goes by, and now they expect a timer to be out every single time. So instead of two just meaning 2-ish minutes or roughly, not exactly two every single time, now they feel like it's a betrayal when it is not exactly 2 minutes because they are expecting that timer in front of them. You might also see kids develop rules like if the schedule changes, it's dangerous, or if I'm not first, I'm losing. Or if I don't win, it's bad. I'm bad. Those are all relational statements linking events to meanings. And if those rules are stronger than the actual contingencies in the room, your typical ABA playbook, let's just put this on extinction, is not going to go well. If the rule is controlling the behavior more than the actual here and now consequences, you can't treat it like a simple escape behavior. You have to acknowledge that you're competing with a whole network of learning, not just they want out of the task. And I'm seeing this with my 3-year-old right now all the time. He is requiring that I pull out a visual timer before I can transition him because of what they're doing at ABA and, to be honest, me using it at home. And I don't mind that for now, but of course we need to fade that out. But when it's not used, we have these huge meltdowns when it comes to transitioning. And same thing is occurring with my older son. But instead of it being about a timer, it's around dessert. We usually give our boys a small dessert after they finish their food at dinner. And guess what? One night we're completely out of desserts in our house, and my older son is in tears over the fact that he's not getting something because he's gotten so used to it being there every single night. And that the rule is I finished my food, and so I get my dessert. And bear in mind, I knew we were out of dessert. I primed him for this. He understood it, and yet still, when the situation finally got there, he was still sobbing. He was still so emotionally distraught about it. So when we acknowledge that we are competing against a whole network of learning and understand that there are relations that we are not necessarily seeing, but that exist, we can take time to work and spend more time teaching new rules and flexible relations, right? Working on the fact that the timer isn't always going to be there. Working on sometimes we don't have dessert and that's okay, but because maybe we're going to get something else like cereal after dinner, which is just as good if you ask me, because cereal is nothing but sugar. And 2 more minutes doesn't mean exactly 2 minutes. It means some extra time. That's all. That we're almost done. Being rigid is a common trait for any individual, but for individuals with autism that thrive in routine and structure, we have to be understanding of the fact that the relations we are building with these kids, not relationships, the relations, the networks of cause and effects that is occurring all around these kiddos. That if we get too stuck in a routine, if we get too stuck in our words, if we follow too strictly on what we're saying, we develop little robots. We develop little rigid machines that are inflexible to the real world. And so we have to develop in our programming real relations that are variable. Let's zoom out for a second and look at social life and peer play and interaction. Social interaction is relational responding on hard mode, on extreme. You have status, fairness, sarcasm, teasing, inside jokes. The difference between someone laughing with you versus someone laughing at you. All of that is relational. We can teach a learner to say, "Hi, my name is," or "What's your name?" or "Do you want to play?" And they might perform those scripts beautifully in a contrived social skills group. But when they hit the playground and the peer says something slightly unexpected, the whole thing can just fall apart. Why? Because in real life, the meaning of what's happening shifts constantly. A peer might say, "Nice shirt," and mean it. Or they might say, "Nice shirt," with a smirk, and that means something completely different. The words are the same. The relational frame is different. So if our social skills programming is just topographies, say this, then this, do this, If that's all it is just a bunch of topographies, a bunch of stimulus responses that are limited in context and in to situations, then we are doing nothing but creating brittle language that breaks apart rapidly. From an RFT point of view, we'd want to help the learner build richer relation networks around tone, facial expressions, context, and the functions of different phrases. And this is where I think it becomes extremely important that, especially when we're working with our older kiddos, that we be real with our kids, that we use sarcasm, that we talk to them like regular kids, like regular teenagers, like regular 9, 10-year-old boys or girls. Because the reality is that they're going to learn more from those real life situations than they will ever learn from some darn social skills group narrative. When you actually put them into situations where sarcasm is real, where you're actually doing a little bit of poking fun at them, then you're actually building opportunities for them to respond appropriately in a safe area where you can prompt them through the correct answers. Of course, this requires consent from them because if you're working on this sort of skill set where you're working on social skills, and higher level communication skills, then obviously they have the ability to consent and understand what they're working through and need to understand that, hey, I'm your therapist and I'm going to poke fun of you just a little bit. And we're going to work on how you can respond to those in different situations. And when you pull it out of nowhere, where you have natural moments of doing it, where you can tease them a little bit or where you can, say nice in the not so nice way, when you can work on these things in a natural but safe place where they understand that nothing you're saying is harmful, nothing that you're saying is real, they can learn how to respond appropriately and handle whether or not it's a bully or just a friend poking fun at them in real life. Now, of course, it needs to be said here. Make sure you've paired well with this client before you're working on these sorts of skills. Make sure that they truly understand and truly consent before you do any sort of thing like this. But the reality is that we can tell them 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 rules to live by for social situations, but things are going to be variable, they're going to change. And that 101,000 rule is going to pop up that they weren't trained for, that they weren't expecting. And so the best way is not necessarily, I mean, social skills groups are wonderful, but it's not necessarily to learn in those situations where they're being lectured and practicing in these precise moments. It's about intertwining them in the moments, in natural moments that occur with people they feel truly safe around. Okay, and finally, let's talk about the fact that words themselves can become triggers. Sometimes the meltdown that you are working through with a kiddo isn't about the denied item. It's about the word no. Sometimes it's not about escape when you say it's time to go to the table. It's about the fact that you said it's work time or it's time to go to the table. If no is almost always preceded with a full withdrawal of attention or access, or if no has been paired with adults getting angry or raising their voices or using physical control, that sound now functions like a threat. Even when you, as the current BCBA or as the new RBT on the team, say it in a nice, calm, kind way with zero history in it. Or think about the fact in our own real lives as employees, when you hear your boss say, "Hey, can I speak with you for a few minutes?" Or, "Hey, I need to meet with you this afternoon." You never think like, "Oh, God, I'm getting a raise. That's why we're meeting." No, you always jump to the conclusion of like, "Oh God, I'm getting fired," or "Oh God, I'm being written up," right? Even if you are the best employee, even if the company is absolutely relying on you, your mind still jumps to the fact that like, "Oh, well, it's my last day." And it's because the reality is that those words, whether to you specifically or to those around you or even in TV shows, have been preceded with and then followed through with uncomfortable, situations, punishment, criticism, or social loss. Those words now function like an EO for anxiety and escape. From an RFT angle, the function of those words has transformed through their relational networks. They're not neutral sounds anymore, they're loaded. It's just like if somebody says my full name, Jeremiah Lucas Burton. I'm like, oh my God, what did I do to deserve that? So few people even know my full name as anything other than Jay. And so when I hear the whole thing coming out of somebody's mouth, I'm like, oh my God, what have I done? Who was that? What, is my wife around? What's going on? Did I forget to take out the trash again? Oh God. All right, but seriously, if you listen to my trauma informed episode, a lot of this sounds familiar, right? We're talking about triggers, we're talking about anxiety ridden words. It's not our job as BCBAs to diagnose anxiety, but it is our job to recognize when words are triggering, when actions are causing anxiety and stress to the ones that we're working with. And it is also our job to develop intervention that soften those words, that make those words be predictable and that they have safe outcome. And teaching their caregivers and their therapists new phrases that carry less historical baggage until the child has been desensitized and associating these words with more predictable and safe outcome. So when we think this way, our ABC data doesn't just say antecedent denied access to tablet. It might say antecedent therapist said no in the context of denied access. That little bit of nuance can change how we intervene. It can change what we focus on. So if RFT helps us explain these patterns of brittle skills, rigid rule following, and stalled social skills, the next question is, what does a BCBA actually do with all this? And I do want to take just a few minutes to ground this in the research, not to drown you in citations, but to calibrate us for expectations. Over the last couple of decades, there has been a growing body of work that has shown that individuals with disabilities and those that have been diagnosed with autism can and have and will continue to learn in an ABA format derived relational responding. Not just simple matching, but things like saying different, bigger, smaller part of, and developing real social context and understanding. And doing so, even when those relations haven't been trained directly in every direction. And the research out there shows encouraging results when we systematically teach relational patterns, like same and different, across multiple exemplars or more or less in both directions. Learners sometimes show new and untrained responses that suggest they're starting to derive relations, not just memorize pairs. And there are also broad studies out there looking at how relational training can support things like perspective taking, problem solving, and understanding of social situations and analogies, especially, obviously, in our verbal learners. Again, the picture is generally positive. It seems like derived relating is teachable for many learners, and building those skills can support broader cognitive and language outcomes. And while each of those interventions deserve their own podcast and time spent on those things, like acceptance and commitment therapy, a lot of RFT research is intertwined with acceptance and commitment therapy, and that deserves its own whole episode. And I do encourage you guys to look at the research out there that is cited on the links to the descriptions of this podcast. But even if you never run a formal RFT program or use a formal RFT research intervention, thinking relationally can improve your clinical decision making. Instead of asking, what other 50 tacks should I add? You might ask, what relations do I want this learner to develop and understand? And then you can look for opportunities to build those in naturalistic, meaningful ways across the day. So with that, that's our backdrop into moving what is in the most important part of this episode is how can BCBAs truly apply these ideas in a broadly speaking way where we're not necessarily pulling directly into interventions, but taking the relational frame theory as a backdrop, as a foundation to what we're putting into place. So let's start with one of my favorite application moves. When a team comes to you and says, we've added many targets and this kid still isn't generalizing, the instinct is often to add more. More nouns, more verbs, more WH questions, more exemplars. From a relational frame perspective, I want you to pause and ask, do we really need more targets? Or do we need more relations? If a child can tact big and small, but can't reliably pick the bigger one, when you vary the objects, drills probably won't fix it. You might need to systematically teach the bigger than, smaller than relations across many different contexts in both directions. So instead of adding 20 more size flashcards or tasks, maybe we run playful activities where we line up items of different sizes and ask things like, show me the biggest, show me the smallest, or which one is bigger than this. And then moving it into functional situations where you actually get rewarded just by getting the bigger or the smaller one. So if you're getting into, if you're giving a bigger snack, right? So if you have a child whose options are the bigger cookie or the smaller cookie, learning to say bigger is definitely going to be reinforcing naturally. Do you want the small chair that you actually fit in, or do you want this giant chair that you can't even climb into? The kid might still want the big one at the end of the day, but that's the things that we're trying to move into where it's more functional and the reward system is built on itself. Same thing when we're teaching same and different. Oh my gosh, I've seen this too often where BCBAs are just putting these singular, these stimulus that are all exactly the same, and there's these same different pictures being put on in front of the child, and that's the only times they're working with the same different. You are not building real relations here. You are just working on a contrived situation with the exact same topographies. Whether or not those you might have 20 pictures, and that's great. I'm so glad that you are working on same different with 20 different pictures. But what about real life? What about outside of this very contrived specific situation? Can the learner actually do it in a different area? So the general rule here is when you see brittle performance, don't automatically throw more topographies, more stimulus at the situation. Ask what relational patterns are missing or underdeveloped. Okay. And now let's talk about programs for flexibility as an outcome, not just for compliance. RFT gives us language for why flexibility matters. If a child's behavioral world is governed by a very small number of rigid rules, it has to be this way or else, then any violation of those rules is going to feel catastrophic. We could respond by doubling down on compliance, more demands, more extinction, more you'll be fine. Or we can respond by explicitly treating flexibility as a teachable skill set. That might look like teaching multiple acceptable responses to the same situation, like if the swing is busy, you can wait, choose a different toy, or ask to join. So a child learns there's more than one right move. It might also look like practicing really small changes with a huge cushion of reinforcement and support. Like today, the schedule is almost the same, but we're going to swap these two activities around and they're going to learn that it isn't the end of the world, that it isn't a catastrophe. By focusing less on compliance and more on working on flexibility and slow desensitization to these situations, we allow the child to come around to these. And at the same time, we can use language all around this instead of putting associations of like, oh, it's too bad that we can't go to gym right now. We can build it as an opportunity. Oh, the gym's not available right now, but we can go and play in sand outside. When we build in language, we set a new history, a new relation with it where they're going to build this in their mind. They're going to be building this stimulus that they're going to be saying to themselves, or at least they're going to be thinking back on. And in that way, they're going to be relating that a fun thing happened when changes occurred. That's one of my favorite things to work on, changes of routine. I absolutely love it when I just mess up the schedule purposely with our kiddos. But I don't start with like, oh, change of schedule. We're not going to gym. We're going to work time. No, absolutely not. It's like change of schedule. I've got this cool new toy in my office. Let's go check it out and bring it to the playroom. This is the thing that allow the child to associate change as not always bad. As different doesn't mean something not fun is going to occur. And that fits perfectly with a scent based and trauma informed care. Flexibility isn't forced, it's shaped safely. We're not teaching kids to give up control, we're teaching them that their world can bend without breaking and that they have skills and support when it does. And the final practical move that I really want us to pay attention to is variation that you're building with your instructions. And this one's going to be obvious. Every single one of you BCBAs out there knows these rules. If your SD is identical, same words, same tones, same setting every single time, you're going to get very tightly discriminated responding. And of course, that's great for early skill acquisition, but if you never loosen that up, you're training the learner to only respond under those exact conditions. And yes, every single BCBA already knows this, right? At least you really should. But how well do your RBTs know this? Because the reality of the situation is that RBTs are coming into this field at a significantly rapid rate and are not always receiving the training, supervision, and support that they truly need. And when just a week goes by with the same SD, you have now created an individual with a very fixed rule in their head. I respond when the SD sounds like this. I respond when the SD, and I get reinforcement when the SD sounds like this. Catching these issues as quickly as possible is extremely important. We get it all the time from SLPs, OTs, and parents, and all over social media that we are creating little robots where they only respond in certain situations. And we as BCBAs want to defend ourselves and say, well, of course, we are working on variation and SD responses and yada, yada, yada. But here's the reality. Are you? Because if you're not checking up on your team on a regular basis and checking that their SDs are truly varying and that they are not just blankly or robotically stating these SDs, then we're reinforcing the stereotypes about our field. And so, yes, I know every single BCBA knows better, but are you truly going out and making sure that variation is truly occurring across the programs that you're writing and designing? Because if they are not, you are creating a robotic little machine. That's all you're making is a child who is responding in specific situations in specific ways. And it does not take long for these relations to develop and to stick. And the work that you have to do to undo that is seismically larger than the work that it took to get it in there in the first place. All right, we're going to pause there for just a second. The second key word is flexibility. 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 Okay, now moving into our last targeted area, we have to talk about acceptance and commitment therapy because every time we have a conversation about RFT, ACT sneaks right in. And that makes sense. Acceptance and commitment therapy pulls heavily from RFT concept, especially around how language can amplify suffering and how we can build more flexible value based patterns of behavior. But I really want to be clear about something. RFT is a theory, arguably one of the best theories of explaining the development of communication from a behavioral standpoint, but a theory nonetheless. ACT is technology that draws from that theory. So let's be gone with this misconception. You do not need to do ACT therapy to benefit from RFT informed thinking in your ABA practice. When we talk about things like building flexible rule systems, teaching kids to tolerate small changes, helping them respond differently to words like no or later or not right now, we are squarely within the domain of applied behavior analysis. We're manipulating antecedents and consequences and teaching new skills and focusing on observable behavior. But if you find yourself to the point where you're designing protocols that sound like full on psychotherapy for caregivers or for older teens, processing trauma, treating panic attacks, addressing eating disorders, that's your cue to consult, coordinate, and refer out. Unless you have explicit and in depth training on such matters, you need to be referring out. And I know as BCBAs, we want to support the families and children that we are working with to the best of our abilities. And ACT seems like an absolute miracle worker. And absolutely, there is so much potential of use around it. But without proper training and proper implementation, we can end up doing more harm than good. So, when we are working on complex language matters that are associated with anxiety, stress, depression, or simply triggers, be aware of your scope and be transparent with the clients and families that you're working with about what your scope is and what specifically you will be working on. And do not promise things that are not attainable or reachable for you as a BCBA. And remember that when it comes to language, always walk into it with a relational mindset that includes keeping it scent and trauma informed at the front and center. If you're working with language, which is every single one of us, there is always going to be a historical pattern. Whether or not that historical pattern includes trauma, coercion, or fear does not matter. You should come from a standpoint of trauma informed care and assume that trauma is there. That does not mean that we expect the worst out of individuals, but that means that when we work with language, we need to have in the back of our mindset that if this child is screaming simply because you said no, or screaming when you tell them to go to the bathroom, it might not be a compliance issue. It might just be that there is a trauma history that we need to consider there. All right, before we wrap up, I want to cover some terminology out there on RFT. And I know I said I would avoid getting into the weeds on this, but when discussing RFT with others, it is important to have these on hand to be able to keep up with the conversation. Not the whole dictionary, not the whole research, just a few that you'll see everywhere, honestly. All right, so the first term we're going to cover is relational frame. A relational frame is basically a learned, generalized pattern of relating things. And by relating, I mean things like same as, or different from, or bigger than, just basically understanding that how does this item, this part, or this stimulus relate to the other environments in my life? And here's why it matters. A lot of our early ABA programming teaches labels. That's a ball, that's a dog, that's a red. But as humans, we have this amazing skill to relate things rapidly to other individual things. And so when we are working with individuals on the spectrum, it is key that we are making those relations or relational frames built into our programs. Okay, and the next term is a long one. It's arbitrarily applicable relational responding, or AARR. And boy, do I wish we could come up with better terms in our field. It sounds like a robot wrote that one, am I right? So AARR, I can't even say it right. AARR. Going through a stutter just trying to say it. It is when someone relates things based on learned cues, not based on physical features. So arbitrary here doesn't mean random. It means not forced, not a physical world about it, not something physical about it. An example is $100 bill is not physically better than a $1 bill in any way, physically, right? They're made out of the same paper, they're nearly identical colors, and it's just some old white guy on both pictures. Very important precedents, of course, but really, arbitrarily, there's nothing different about them, but we know that 100 has more value. That's an arbitrarily applied relation. Society teaches it, language teaches it, reinforcement history teaches it, or taking names of individuals in our lives, right? Nothing about a man's physical demeanor, physical traits makes him quote unquote dad or father. That relation exists because of a history and context. A child learns this person is dad, and that relation starts controlling behavior, who they seek comfort from, who they listen to, who they feel safe with. And as they get older, and as their language develops, it starts to mean other things, other contexts. So they hear things like Darth Vader, right? He's the father of two kids in the Star Wars universe, right? And so, like, their relationship and understanding of what it means that Darth Vader is a parent has a contextual clue back to their own father. And hopefully, they're thinking, oh man, Luke's father, other than the whole Force thing, kind of sucks in comparison to my dad, right? So those relations develop as we get older, and they can make those assumptions that like this is better than that. And this kind of makes me think of those kids, when we were all kids and we are on the playground, like, my dad's bigger than your dad. My dad could beat up your dad. Yeah, I mean, that's where those relations start to develop is that we start to understand and having a greater context of what father means and that every single individual has their own father. And clinically, this is huge because so many of our learners struggle less with seeing and understanding what their physical world is and more with the meanings behind it. They can discriminate physical differences fine, but arbitrary relations like fair or promises or later or this is the rule, those can be sticky and hard for individuals, especially individuals that with autism that oftentimes take language so literally it's difficult for them to oftentimes understand. All right, and the third term you oftentimes hear in RFT is mutual entailment. This is basically the idea that if you learn a relationship in one direction, you can derive the reverse relation without teaching. So if you learn A is bigger than B, you can derive B is smaller than A. If you learn this is the opposite of that, you can derive the reverse that is the opposite of this. This matters in ABA because a lot of our learners learn things in one direction, but don't automatically flip it. They might be able to tact apple, but not respond to show me apple, right? So we've definitely seen this in our practices. So mutual entailment is basically just a fancy way of saying humans flip relations, and some learners need that flipping top more explicitly. All right. And the fourth term is combinatorial. Ooh, did I say that right? Combinant. Ooh, that's a hard word to say. Combinatorial. Combinatorial. That is a hard one to say, guys. Combinatorial entailment. This is when relations combine. If you learn relations among A to B and B to C, you can derive new relationships between A and C. So the classic example again being A is bigger than B and B is bigger than C, so therefore A is bigger than C. And in real life, this is extremely important because life is loaded with these combinations. If a learner learns that Texas is a state and states are part of the US, they can derive Texas is part of the US. That's combinatorial entailment, right? We're learning things in a more efficient way where everything doesn't have to be explicit. Now, if you're thinking right now, isn't this all just stimulus equivalence? You're really not far off. Mutual entailment and combinatorial entailment are parts of stimulus equivalence. But what we need to understand when we think of these terms is that it is different from stimulus equivalence because stimulus equivalence is the applied action of it actually occurring. It is the observed, yes, we can see it, this is actually occurring. Where relational frame and these terms are the theory behind it occurring, the explanation of why. It is the theory that humans have evolved to make these relations, mutual and combinatorial, more rapidly than any other animal has been able to do. And it is for that reason that we pick up and learn language so rapidly as a child. So if somebody asks you next week, what is the difference between stimulus equivalence and relational frame theory, you can quickly just say, one is the applied, realistic, we can observe it happening, which is stimulus equivalence, and one is the theory behind why that is occurring, relational frame theory. All right, and the fifth and final term that we're going to go over is transformation of stimulus function. This is the idea that a stimulus can change what it does to behavior because of its relations. In plain language, words and meaning can change how something feels and how someone responds. So a word can become a trigger. A label can create avoidance. A rule can make something feel dangerous or unfair even when nothing physically has changed. If later or maybe tomorrow has been followed by disappointment hundreds of times because later never occurs, then later becomes aversive. It equals no. So even though the word later literally means in the future at a later time, to a child who is hearing it constantly and never actually seeing it followed through with it occurring in the future, that word becomes the word no. It has transformed its stimulus. The physical properties of it, the sound waves, if you will, have remained the same, but the meaning behind it, the relationship between the sound and the actual outcomes has changed. All right, so those are our 5 terms. And I think, honestly, if you have those in the back of your mind when you're having a conversation about RFT, you can keep up with just about anyone, at least on a fundamental level. All right, guys, let's wrap this up. And before we end the episode, here are the pillars I want you to walk away with. First, RFT helps explain why knowing words isn't the same as having flexible language. A learner can have hundreds of tacks and mans and interverbals in their data book, right, in their brain, and still struggle to use language in real time. When things get messy, emotional, or unpredictable situations arise, they lose control of the situation and of the language and how to apply it. The gap is often relational. We've built islands of skills instead of connected networks. Second, rigidity often isn't simple defiance. A lot of time, it's rule following that's become too strong, or relations that have developed that we are not fully aware of, and we need to take into consideration from a trauma informed lens. All right, and third, you don't need to be an expert in RFT to use these ideas. You don't need to memorize every frame type or run highly technical protocols to get value. Understanding the theory behind what we do allows us to apply our work and our techniques with greater precision and understanding. And fourth, when we treat language as a powerful behavioral process, as a power engine of learning, not just a list of words, we're more likely to design programs that respect the lived experience of our learners and to build relations that are more applicable to the learner. All right, guys, that's our show. And don't panic if you're thinking the third keyword was missed. Here it comes. The third keyword is meaning. MEANING, meaning. Those are your 3 keywords, guys. Write those down. And remember, if you are a BCABA, BCBA, or BCBAD, this episode does count as 1 CEU. Just head over to aba-ceus.com where you can purchase the episode using those 3 keywords. You'll get your certificate back in about 24 to 48 hours. And if you want to track down any of the research articles I referenced today, just check the episode description on whatever platform you're listening on. I'll have the sources listed there. And remember, if you liked what you heard in this show today, please share it with a friend, leave a review on the platform that you listen to, or give it to that student that's been struggling to understand RFT. Thank you for spending this hour with me and for the work you're doing with the kids and families we serve. I'm Jay Burton, and as always, thanks for going beyond the data.
Bye. See you